Well, Australian rent prices grew 11.5% last year. According to the latest PropTrack Market Insight Report, capital city rents rose 13.2% year on year, led by strong increases in Sydney, Melbourne and Perth. Joining me now live is PropTrack senior economist Angus Moore. Angus, thanks for joining us. Rents are up. We're certainly not surprised. How much did the average renter pay last year compared to the previous year?
Yeah, thank you for having me. Look, as you say, we've seen enormous increases in rents over 2023. In Sydney and Melbourne, we're seeing close to 20% increases in rent. In Perth, it was 20%, which is an enormously quick increase in rents. To kind of put that in context, frame where we should be. A more typical pace for rent growth is something like the inflation target of 2 to 3%. So at 20% in Perth, at 17, 18% in Sydney and Melbourne, we are way above that pace at the moment. And even nationally at 11.5% in the past year, still well ahead of what we might consider more typical.
So 11.5%, then how much on average is the median renter paying now?
So if we're looking at some of our larger capital cities like Sydney, median rents there are $700 a week, which is clearly very expensive, and it is the most expensive of our capital cities. Melbourne is a bit more affordable at $550 a week. If we're looking across the capital cities as a whole, typical rents there are sitting around $600 a week at the moment, which is a 13% jump from where they stood at the end of 2022, a pretty sharp increase.
That is a very sharp increase for renters. Now, you mentioned Perth has seen quite a rise. Why in that capital city? What's going on there?
Yeah, Perth has certainly seen eye-watering growth in rents in the past year. 20% is, no matter how you cut it, incredibly quick. To put some numbers on that, that's going from $500 at the end of 2022 to $600 at the end of 2023. So $100 jump, incredibly quick growth in rents. The reason we're seeing that is rental markets in Perth are incredibly tight. That's true across much of the country, but Perth in particular, it's consistently rating alongside Adelaide as the lowest vacancy rate in the country, or to put it another way, the capital city with the fewest available rentals for renters to move into. What that means is that when rentals do become available, they're extremely competitive, they're leasing quickly, and we're seeing pressure on rents as a result.
Yeah, and it's if you're a tenant, it's certainly not getting any easier. How about the regions? How did they fare in this latest data?
The regions are a really interesting story. They've obviously been the big story throughout the pandemic, both for home prices and for rents. We saw a lot of people moving from capital cities into the regions. That meant regional property markets saw enormous price and rent growth across the pandemic. The good news for regional renters is we have seen a bit of a reprieve. Across the regional areas as a whole, rents have been on hold since June. Now, to be clear, they're still much more expensive than they were pre-pandemic because of the increases that we've seen over 2020, 21, 22. But at least over recent months, we've not seen further increases. So some good news for regional renters there.
That is very positive. What about the outlook for this year? Will there be any reprieve for renters at all?
Unfortunately, in the near term, the answer is probably not. We're heading into January. It's normally the busiest month for rental markets. Rental availability is still incredibly low, as represented by vacancy rates sitting at very, very low levels. It means it's going to be very competitive and we'll continue to see pressure on rents. As we get a bit later into 2024, there is maybe some signs of a silver lining and a bit of a reprieve for renters. While rents have grown very strongly over 2023, it was a bit slower than we saw in 2022, particularly in places like Brisbane, where we're still seeing strong growth, nearly 10% in 2023, but we saw 20% in 2022. So things are maybe starting to slow down. And if that continues, we might start to see a bit of a reprieve for renters later this year.
Okay, well, that's good news, certainly. We'll wait for that. Angus Moore, thanks for joining us.